So we're trying to discuss the cosmological argument now, and as usual on this show, we're going to try to debunk the religious claims that the cosmological argument has any substance for proving the existence of God. The first question is, what is the cosmological argument? I'm going to answer that with three further questions. The first question is the world contingent? Are the things we see in the world dependent on a cause for their existence? Do we see things that are demanding some kind of explanation? Because we could just make the claim like Russell did that the world just is what it is, and it doesn't really necessitate a cause. Number two, can it infinitely regress? So infinite regress means you keep looking for causes of something, which means you look for causes of the causes. So you might say it's kind of like the Russian doll, where wherever you open it, there's a smaller doll inside. That's infinite regress if you kept doing it forever. There's a lot of people that say you can't infinitely regress, that it's absurd, and some people that say it's a paradox, you don't really have a choice. The third question is, does it show a religious God? So even if you came to the conclusion that there was something responsible for the contingency in nature, and you even concluded that it was an intelligent being, would that equal a God? This is the history segment. So now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about Aristotle. His conception was the unmoved mover. And what that really means in common sense terms is that there has to be a solid truth. It means somewhere, if you're going to talk, if you're going to have reasons, if you're going to have things, if you're going to have conversations even about those things, you have to have truth underlying them. And at some point, that truth has to be unmoved, which means it has to exist on its own. It can't be subject to the same requirements of a physical thing or a physical law. Aquinas's point was that there's a chain of contingency, which is similar to what I'm saying, that you see things that require ultimately an unmoved mover. You see chains of causality that must have begun somewhere. Aquinas is 1225 to 1274, so we're dealing with 13th century. That's pretty old. To the 17th, 18th century with Leibniz, who comes up with this idea of sufficient reason. And so, again, not that different. If we see contingencies in nature, that shows something must exist outside of those contingencies. It's almost like Kant's noumenal. In a sense, we deductively claim based on the contingencies, the causalities, the chains of these causalities, that something outside that is not subject to the same causality must be the mover of those things. Let's move ahead to the 18th century, my favorite one. We're not going to be able to talk about Reid, but we can talk about Hume, who moved all of these discussions into the secular realm. Hume's point as the empirical skeptic is that we form notions of causality from patterns, and these patterns turn out to be purely mental and not empirical, which means we form our conception of truths, for instance, that we need a causal entity or that we need some kind of substance at the beginning of these causal chains. For Hume, there wasn't even a causal chain. So we, through habituation and a kind of mental mirage, there's no necessity for something starting it. So for Hume and his theory of bundle of sensations that are self, are objects, are theories about causality, are all just formed by habit and more of, a mirage than they are some kind of fact, some kind of empirical knowledge, some kind of knowledge that we can claim. It is merely just a feeling that we call a fact. And of course, we're wrong in doing that. And Kant follows this up. So Kant's really the one who wanted to close the door on all three arguments, especially what's called the rational arguments for the existence of God. So we've already talked about teleological, which is argument from design. But the cosmological argument, what came first, what caused this motion in the first place, this sequence of events in the first place. And I hope you see here that that's not dramatically different from teleological. I think cosmological and argument from design are in some ways bound up together and suffer or benefit from the same structure. So Kant's point, if you're going to try to prove a God, you cannot do it rationally and you shouldn't try. So his point about the cosmological one is that it mistakes proving something existing, a thing, from there being a logical necessity for it. So if you go back through the causal chain and you say that based on this causal chain, there's a demand for some kind of creator at the beginning, that doesn't prove the existence of a thing. It only says there's the demand for the thing. So proving existence is very different than requiring one from logical necessity, according to Kant. Russell, of course, the beginning of the 20th century, was definitely a proponent of the idea that the world just is, that it does not require some kind of explanation for its contingency. And based on Hume, the fact that there really wasn't any real contingency. Another important fact about Russell's argument, which is analytical, which is a lot of what Russell did, was that he points out theists accept God as a brute fact. They just say the chain stops here. There is a God. Can't talk about it anymore. And Russell's point is if theists can do that about God, he can do it about contingency. He can say the world just is. We don't need to talk about it anymore. Do you see how that works logically? Therefore, there are brute facts in the world, so Russell can use one just like theists do, which is an interesting way of putting it, even though that's kind of common sense. Like that would come to anyone giving this any real thought. My three main arguments against, I'm going to tell you the three really quick. One, the problem with infinite regress, that it's a paradox. You kind of can't keep going back, but you kind of have to, which is a paradox, which I've said more recently is the definition of philosophy. It's a paradox. Once you get past the paradox, you go into a different realm. So, for instance, once you find scientific evidence for something, it's no longer a paradox. And then it's science, not philosophy. So we would then say the discussion of cosmological is religious, not philosophical. And if you're not of the belief that religious is a way of knowing, because it is just faith, and when you really look at faith, it's just guessing. And you see most religious people that want to do it root their arguments ultimately in science and philosophy. And we've just explained why it's neither one. So they're talking in realms in which they can't have any possible success. So the infinite regress is the main reason they get stuck. Number two, religious motivation. It is that these have been debunked for centuries and people still hang on to them for emotional reasons. And when you look at how problematic they are, the fact that they don't move past rational arguments means that they must want to live in the rational world and in the scientific or philosophical world and benefit from that, but then prove something outside of it, which isn't possible. So that religious motivation shows really why you're getting this question from Cosmological. And it also shows you why you shouldn't expect any more success from it than Kant thought you got in 1800. So number three reason is, I'm going to read you a quote. Even if the cosmological argument is sound and cogent, the difficult task remains to show the God of religion, which means, again, the same problem with teleological and the ultimate door slamming on both of them. And that is that even if for some reason you accept the contingency, the chain of contingency, the brute fact that there has to be a creator at the beginning, there has to be a cause, that cause doesn't have to have a cause. This is a lot of brute facts, by the way. If you accept all of that, tells you nothing about what that thing is. There's absolutely nothing in any of this argumentation that tells you what that creator is. And again, could be an alien. You could then say that alien just happens to not require a cause. You could say it about a potato chip. So that's part of the problem. That's hopefully a fleshed out version of cosmological. I hope you can see why it fails. For those three reasons I wrapped it up with. Thanks for watching.